This lecture will this lecture will present deafness and hearing impairments. We will begin with a quote from Jack Gannon. "We have been called deaf mutes, mutes, objects of charity, deaf and dumb, semi-mutes, dummy, and now hearing impaired. We have been described as the most understood among the sons of man. Some of us are deaf, and some of us are deaf with a capital D. Some of us use American Sign Language, and some of us do not." Let's take a look at the history of deaf culture to get a better idea of what he means. If we look back into early Christianity, we see that deafness was considered a sin. It was a punishment to the parents for their sins, God's anger, a sign of God's anger. At the same time, Benedictine monks were taking a vow of silence, and through that vow of silence, they began to develop their own form of sign language. If we move quite a bit up to the 1500s and 1600s, you'll see that the Benedictine monk Pedro Ponce de Leon teaches speech to deaf. Juan Pablo Bonet becomes an advocate of early sign language, and he wrote the first well-known manual of alphabetic signs for the deaf way back in 1620. If we look at the history of education for deaf students, we'll see that back in the early 1800s, the social and economic conditions and a religious determination that deaf individuals should not be excluded from learning led to founding schools for students who are deaf in the United States. As deaf students began to gather, they developed a set of shared experience to create the deaf culture. One example of this was in Martha's Vineyard. Between the years of 1690 and 1880, Martha's Vineyard had areas where there were families with hereditary hearing problems. As many as 25% of the residents were deaf. The villagers developed their own sign language, and the town hall meetings were in sign. We then moved from a state of asylums to schools, from housing people to educating people. The first permanent school was called the Connecticut Asylum for the Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb. Today it is called the American School for the Deaf. The first American School for the Deaf was founded in 1817. And this was Thomas Gallaudet, and he was the first American deaf educator. He went to Europe to see what they were doing and brought the ideas back to found the American Schools of the Deaf, converting the asylums to schools. In the 1800s, there was a push to create a deaf state. This was John Flournoy, who was a student of Gallaudet, and he proposed to Congress the creation of a deaf state in the Western Territories. They wanted to form their own deaf community free of prejudice, restrictive good intentions of the Hearing Society. In 1864, Gallaudet opened the college, Gallaudet College. This is the only accredited U.S. institution of higher ed for the deaf. Abraham Lincoln signed the original school charter. They are still one of the leaders in higher ed for the deaf. In the 1870s, Alexander Graham Bell had a huge influence on education for the deaf. He came from a family history of hearing loss and had an early career as a deaf educator. In 1872, he founded the Oral School for the Deaf. So you'll see the change from the other schools who were looking at forming sign language, and he wanted to form an oral school. In 1876, he invented the telephone to mechanize speech, and this began the oral backlash against sign language. In 1892, we got the first hearing aids. They were not easy to use. As you can see by the picture, they were very big and heavy. They weren't easily portable, but it was a step in the right direction. Sports had a large influence on deaf culture and hearing culture in general. William, quote, Dummy Hoy was a deaf player who could see strike calls from the outfield in baseball. In the 1920s, the Gallaudet University football team started hiding signed instructions in huddle formation. You still see both of these occurring in current day professional and all levels of sports, with sign language being used so that the others cannot hear. We then had the invention of the phone for the deaf, which was called a teletypewriter. It allowed deaf people to access phones and type out conversations. As we go into the post-Civil War era and the early 1900s, we had a societal emphasis on the use of English and the importance of speech rather than sign language. Oftentimes, speech therapists use candles to help deaf students learn to speak, because the flame would flicker when a student correctly pronounced letters such as T, B, and P. Here is a picture of a group of deaf students who are listening to a piano recital. They have a bent metal plate clamped in their teeth to feel the vibrations of the music. If we pop forward to the 1960s, we'll see the diversity and unity of deaf life was realized. During this era, much changed for deaf students. There was an academic recognition of American Sign Language as its own language. There was racial desegregation of schools. Interpreting became a profession. Diverse educational options, cochlear implants, captioning, and communications access. The deaf culture blossomed through the civil rights era as many people got more rights. In 1972, a huge step became when we started captioning programs. The French Chef was the first TV show to be fully captioned. In 1993, the FCC required all TVs to have closed captioning, a decoding chip. The Rehab Act of 1973 required access and equal opportunity for persons with disability. It required accommodations for the deaf, the telephones, and interpreters to be available at all public events. In 1985, we had a huge technological advance when cochlear implants were approved. They were approved for students or people 18 years and older. It bypasses the inner ear bones and places electrodes into cochlea. It absorbs the sound waves, and they're interpreted by auditory nerves. It's important to know that cochlear implants do not make people hearing. It changes the sounds that they can hear, as we'll see in some other videos. In 1988, the Gallaudet students protested having another hearing president. And so King Jordan became the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. And the Congress also recommended that American Sign Language, or ASL, became the primary language for deaf. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed, and this created a situation where discriminatory practices and obstacles were outlawed for individuals with disabilities, which includes people who are deaf or hearing impaired. It required increased communication, education, and employment opportunities for the deaf. And again, this was when the closed captioning decoder chips were required for all TVs. So the present status of deaf education in the United States. As you all know about IDEA, there's a definition, an impairment in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, that adversely affects a child's performance. As with all the disabilities, those key words, adversely affects the child's educational performance, is key. What's the incidence of people having hearing loss? It affects individuals of all ages, and it may occur at any time from infancy through old age. Most people with hearing loss are adults. 1.2% of disabled students have hearing impairments. That means if we take all the people who have disabilities, 1.2% of them have hearing impairments. That is not 1.2% of all people, but of all disabled people. It is likely that many more students have hearing impairments but receive services under a different label. So they may have a hearing impairment and also a learning disability, but the learning disability is determined to be the qualifying factor. If we look at characteristics, students with hearing loss have very different characteristics, just as you and I do. Some of these characteristics can differ depending on the degree of hearing loss, dependent on the attitudes of the parents and siblings, if they become people who sign, if they get a cochlear implant. What are the opportunities to acquire their first language? Again, this comes back to, is their first language American Sign Language, their second language English, or vice versa? Or it may not be English, maybe a different language. And is there presence of other disabilities? The academic achievement. So deafness imposes no limitations on the cognitive capabilities of the individual. This is so important to remember, as this was not the belief long ago. However, most children with hearing loss have difficulties with all areas of academic achievement. My question to you is why? This is something we'll discuss in one of our activities. So what are the technologies and supports? There's hearing aids, there's FM devices. Many teachers will wear those, a microphone, and the person can have the FM device. There's cochlear implants, interpreters, speech-to-text translations, television captioning, text telephones, alerting devices. And as you know, the technology now is advancing so rapidly. It is changing regularly, and it's quite easy to get captioning done. The educational approaches are varied. We have oral approaches, which is training to understand speech. There's total communication, in which both speech and manual or sign language is taught. And then there's American Sign Language, which takes a bilingual, bicultural approach. So for example, in the United States, people are part of the deaf culture as well as part of the U.S. culture. They are learning American Sign Language alongside English, becoming bilingual and bicultural. I hope you enjoy investigating more about the deaf culture and deafness.